You are standing in the cool stone shadow of a medieval monastery. The walls are tall, cold, and gray, built not to invite, but to contain. The monastery looms in quiet strength, not unlike a fortress, yet without the banners or the trumpets of a castle. Instead, its strength is silence, discipline, and routine. You are about to enter the cloister, and in doing so, step into a life that few outside the monastery would ever fully understand. The life of a medieval monk was, on the surface, one of holiness, discipline, and devotion. But beneath that surface was another story, one of endless burdens, struggles against human weakness, and daily routines so monotonous and difficult that they might seem unbearable to an outsider. To live as a monk in the Middle Ages was not simply to pray and sing hymns. It was to submit, entirely and often painfully, to the rule. The rule of Saint Benedict, written centuries earlier in the 6th century, guided most monastic communities in medieval Europe. It was not a suggestion, it was a command. Every action of a monk's day, from the moment he opened his eyes in the early hours of the morning until he closed them again at night, was ordered by this strict framework. Monks were to obey without hesitation, to submit their wills to their abbots, and to abandon personal desires. In the cloister, individuality faded. You might imagine the day beginning peacefully, with the soft tolling of a bell echoing across the stone courtyards. But for the monks, it began with interruption, often in the dead of night. The first service, known as matins or vigils, could take place as early as 2 in the morning. Imagine being pulled from the thin straw mattress, the cold stone floor biting against your bare feet as you shuffle silently into the church. The darkness is thick, the air heavy with the smell of tallow candles, and the chants begin, not for a few minutes, but often for hours. That it was not a matter of choice. No monk could simply decide to sleep a little longer. Discipline ruled over the body. And so the monk would chant psalms in the dark, his voice blending into dozens of others, the sound echoing against stone walls. It was repetitive, often dull, and exhausting. The very monotony was meant to shape the monk's soul, stripping away pride and independence. After prayers, the daily rhythm shifted into work. One might think of monks spending their days in study or illuminated manuscripts, but for most, the work was physical and unending. The monastery was a self-sufficient community, and every task needed hands. Some monks tended gardens, breaking soil with tools that wore blisters into their palms. Others herded animals, rising before dawn to milk cows or sheep. Others worked in the kitchens, their hands raw from scrubbing pots in icy water. It is here that the darker side of monastic life emerges, not in scandal, but in drudgery. A monk was not a free man, he could not simply choose his labor. He was assigned work, often harsh and relentless. Refusal was not tolerated. Every misstep, every act of disobedience, was noted and punished. Meals offered little relief. The rule of Saint Benedict dictated silence in the refectory, the dining hall. Imagine sitting with your brothers, dozens of men gathered in silence, eating the same meager portions, bread, vegetables, sometimes beans, occasionally fish. Meat was rare, forbidden entirely for monks of certain orders. While they ate, one monk read aloud from scripture or the lives of saints, ensuring that even mealtime was not free from discipline. The food was plain, often repetitive, and sometimes insufficient, leaving many monks hungry. Silence itself was one of the heaviest burdens. Monks were required to keep their words to a minimum, speaking only when permitted. The rule declared that silence was the guardian of the soul. But for the men who lived within these walls, silence was also a form of control. To suppress words was to suppress thoughts. And to suppress thoughts was to crush individuality. A monk might go days, weeks, or even months without casual conversation. Imagine that stillness, living surrounded by men, yet unable to speak freely with them. Clothing was another weight of conformity. The monastic habit, usually a simple woolen tunic with a hood, was coarse and heavy. It itched against the skin, and it was worn not for comfort but as a symbol of poverty and humility. Monks often owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothing. Washing was infrequent, and the smell of wool soaked with sweat and dampness was something every monk endured. The vow of poverty stripped monks of all personal possessions. A man might once have owned a family heirloom, a carved knife, or a simple keepsake from his home. But upon entering the monastery, all such things were surrendered. The monk owned nothing, not even the clothes on his back. His life was not his own. His time, his labor, even his thoughts belonged to the community and to God. And yet, while the monastery was meant to be a place of holiness, it was still inhabited by human beings. Monks grew tired, hungry, and resentful. They struggled with temptations, with boredom, and with the crushing monotony of repetition. Discontent simmered quietly behind stone walls. Some monks longed for freedom. Some secretly resisted rules. And others, despite vows of humility, sought influence within the cloister, jockeying for power under the very eyes of the abbot. The cloister was a paradox. It was meant to bring men closer to God, but it often highlighted their weaknesses. It promised peace, but it imposed burdens. It demanded silence, but within that silence, human frustrations whispered endlessly. So, as you stand at the edge of the cloister and watch the monks shuffle past in their heavy habits, you might wonder, did this life truly bring them closer to the divine? Or was it a slow erosion of the human spirit, hidden behind the thick, silent walls of stone? When you think of obedience, you may imagine a child listening to a parent, or a soldier following a commander. But within the walls of a medieval monastery, obedience was something far heavier. It was not occasional. It was not negotiable. It was constant, unyielding, and absolute. The monk's life was defined by it. You must picture the abbot, the head of the monastery, seated at the center of this web of obedience. His role was not simply to oversee spiritual matters. He was master, father, ruler, and judge. The monks called him Dominus, Lord, and his word carried weight greater than any personal thought. If the abbot commanded, a monk obeyed. If the abbot rebuked, a monk endured. The abbot's authority stretched into every corner of life, from the tone of chanting in the choir, to the speed of hoeing a row of cabbages. This was no accident. The rule of Saint Benedict declared obedience the first step of humility. A monk must renounce his own will entirely. He must set aside pride, preference, even reason. To obey was to kill the self. To disobey was to sin. Imagine what that meant in daily life. If you were sick but ordered to work, you worked. If you were exhausted but called to prayer, you rose. If you were humiliated, you remained silent. For many, this demanded a breaking of spirit. Some new monks, recently entered into the cloister, resisted quietly at first. They might sigh heavily when given a task, or drag their feet to show reluctance. But such behavior was dangerous. The abbot and senior monks watched closely for signs of rebellion. The rule made clear that even silent dissatisfaction was sinful. A monk was to obey, promptly, without delay, and without grumbling. Punishments awaited those who faltered. Discipline in monasteries was not simply spiritual, it was physical and psychological. A monk who spoke out of turn might be forced to eat alone in silence, cut off from the community's meager companionship. A monk who disobeyed might be excluded from prayers, treated as though invisible until his repentance was shown. More severe infractions could lead to public confession, where the monk prostrated himself before his brothers, begging forgiveness. And then there were harsher measures still: fasting, whipping, confinement. Records from medieval monasteries describe monks beaten for disobedience, denied food for days, or locked in small cells to contemplate their failures. Discipline was not always gentle, and though it was justified in the name of salvation, it bore the marks of control and fear. Yet obedience was not merely about rules. It reached deep into the psychology of each monk. Imagine living day after day where nothing you did was your own decision. You did not choose when to rise, when to sleep, what to eat, or what to wear. You did not decide what work to perform, or even which passages of scripture to study. Choice was absent. In a world where free will was considered both gift and danger, the monastery demanded that will be surrendered entirely. This surrender carried weight on the body. A monk who rose in the dead of night for matins, who worked fields from morning until dusk, who fasted frequently and ate sparingly, found his strength diminished. Chronic fatigue and malnutrition were not uncommon. Some monks developed permanent illnesses from years of fasting and exposure to cold. Yet they continued, bound by obedience to rules that left little room for human weakness. There was also a burden on the mind. Medieval monks were expected not only to work and pray but to guard their thoughts. They were to banish distractions, to resist temptation, to keep their inner selves as disciplined as their outer actions. The rule warned against murmuring, the secret dissatisfaction of the heart. But how could one silence a restless mind? Monks struggled with wandering thoughts, with frustration, with longing for the outside world. A single memory of a family meal, a warm hearth, or laughter could feel like rebellion. Temptation was perhaps the greatest enemy. The cloister walls might keep out armies and strangers, but they could not keep out the human condition. Monks wrestled with desires for food, for companionship, for touch, for freedom. The strict vow of celibacy demanded purity not only in action but in thought. To think of a woman, even in passing, was to stumble spiritually. To dwell on such thoughts was to sin. Manuals written for confessors of monks reveal a world of hidden struggles, impure dreams, secret cravings, forbidden touches. Though cloisters were built on silence, inside many monks carried storms of conflict. The daily grind of prayer, too, was a burden. Hours upon hours were devoted to chanting psalms, often in Latin, a language many monks barely understood beyond rote memorization. The chanting was repetitive, unending. A psalm recited once might inspire devotion, but repeated dozens of times in a week, hundreds of times in a year, became mechanical. Monks themselves admitted to drifting into sleep mid-chant, their voices still mumbling words as their minds wandered. And yet, even in this heavy rhythm, some monks found purpose. Obedience, though crushing, also provided certainty. To surrender your will meant never needing to decide. To obey meant you could set aside responsibility for outcomes. The abbot commanded, and you obeyed. If the work was painful, the hunger sharp, the exhaustion overwhelming, none of it was yours to question. Some monks described this as a strange peace, like a river flowing endlessly in the same direction. But others found it suffocating, like being buried alive in ritual. Life within the cloister was, in truth, uneven. Some abbots ruled with severity, others with gentleness. Some monasteries enforced strict punishments, while others allowed more lenience. Yet across Europe, the principle of obedience remained at the heart of monastic life. Without it, the monastery could not function. With it, monks endured a life stripped of personal freedom. The irony is sharp. The monastery promised freedom from sin, from temptation, from the chaos of the world. But that freedom came at the cost of personal liberty. To live as a monk was to live without choice, without voice, without ownership of one's own life. The burden of obedience was both shield and shackle. As you walk now through the cloister, you might pause in the silent corridors, the air heavy with the smell of wax and old stone. The monks pass by, eyes lowered, voices hushed. You may wonder, did they find in obedience a path to holiness? Or did it slowly erode their humanity, leaving only the shell of men whose wills had been broken under the weight of the rule? The monastery was meant to be a haven, a sanctuary where men withdrew from the chaos of the world, seeking the divine in silence and discipline. But as the centuries wore on, monasteries also became places where the human spirit was tested, sometimes beyond its endurance. Behind the gray stone walls and the carefully tended gardens, monks carried invisible weights. Their cloisters, designed for peace, often became prisons of the soul. For some, the breaking point came quietly. A young novice, perhaps, after years of struggling to rise for midnight prayers, simply stopped showing up. Another monk, weary of endless labor, grew careless in his tasks, leaving weeds to grow unchecked in the gardens. There were no dramatic rebellions with swords and fire. Instead, resistance often took the form of small acts, sighs, delays, half-hearted chanting, or even moments of forbidden laughter when the abbot was out of sight. But other monks chose more drastic paths. Some abandoned their vows altogether. To leave the cloister was considered a grave sin, a betrayal of God, yet records across Europe tell of monks who fled. Some returned to families, others vanished into towns, and a few were captured and dragged back, forced into public penance. The monastery, for all its walls and rules, could not entirely contain the human longing for freedom. Still, most endured. Endurance was itself a form of survival, a way of bending without breaking. The cloister demanded resilience, not the resilience of warriors or kings, but the resilience of men who faced boredom, hunger, and monotony day after day. To survive as a monk was to survive the slow erosion of individuality. And yet, in this survival, the monastery left behind a strange legacy. Though monks suffered, their lives preserved knowledge and culture. Their endless hours of prayer and work, their submission to silence, their obedience to the rule, all of it created a rhythm that allowed for something else to flourish. In the quiet scriptoria, monks copied manuscripts line by line, preserving texts of ancient Rome and Greece, scriptures, and chronicles. Their suffering became the foundation for Europe's intellectual survival through the so-called Dark Ages. It is a paradox that the very monotony that crushed monks as individuals also built a bridge for civilizations. Their daily drudgery produced continuity. The cloister's rigidity meant that manuscripts were copied with accuracy, fields were tilled without fail, and prayers echoed without end. The burden of silence ensured concentration. The weight of obedience ensured discipline. But to focus only on this cultural contribution risks overlooking the human cost. For the monks themselves, the cloister was not history, it was their life. Imagine sitting in the refectory year after year, eating the same bread and beans, listening to scripture read aloud, forbidden to speak your own thoughts. Imagine waking at midnight, stumbling into the chapel, and chanting until your voice rasped, only to rise again at dawn and repeat the cycle. Imagine being punished for hunger, for laughter, for forgetting a line of a psalm. This was the darker side of monastic life, not scandal or corruption, but the quiet, grinding burden of a life stripped of freedom. For some, this sacrifice was a path to holiness. For others, it was a slow suffocation of the spirit. And so, as you leave the cloister in your mind's eye, stepping out through the heavy wooden doors and into the open air, you may carry with you a final question: was the monastery a sanctuary of peace, or was it a cage of discipline? Did the monks find salvation in their silence, or did they surrender too much of their humanity in pursuit of the divine? The walls remain, silent and gray. The chants echo faintly in memory. But the answer, whether the cloister was blessing or burden, remains locked in the silent hearts of the men who once walked its corridors. You step into a room that is both silent and alive. The air smells of ink, thick, iron-based, and metallic. A faint odor of animal skin lingers too, for parchment, made from the hides of sheep or goats, is the foundation of every page. The sound is almost imperceptible, the scratch of quills across parchment, the faint creak of wooden stools, and the occasional clearing of a throat quickly silenced. This is the scriptorium, the heart of a medieval monastery's intellectual life, and it is here that monks waged their quietest but most exhausting battles. The scriptorium was a workshop unlike any other. Its purpose was preservation. Books in the Middle Ages were not objects mass-produced, they were labors of months, sometimes years. Every letter, every mark, was formed by hand. To be a scribe was to give not only your hours but your very body to the work. Eyes strained under poor light, backs bent in endless stooping, hands cramped from repetition. The task was not glamorous. It was often tedious, even painful. And yet, it was considered holy labor. Picture the conditions. Most scriptoria were lit only by narrow windows or oil lamps. Too much light risked damaging the fragile parchment, too little meant squinting at every line. In winter, the cold stone rooms made fingers stiff and numb. In summer, the heat caused sweat to drip onto pages, smudging ink. There was little relief in any season. A monk might sit for 6 or 8 hours at a stretch, copying line after line in silence, the monotony broken only by the need to sharpen his quill with a small knife. The materials themselves were burdensome. Parchment was expensive, requiring the skin of animals carefully prepared, scraped, and stretched. Monks treated it with respect, but they also bore the anxiety of waste. To make a mistake on parchment was costly. Some errors could be scraped away with a knife, but too many mistakes ruined a page. The fear of error pressed heavily on scribes, especially those less skilled or weary from long hours. Imagine the tension: one misplaced letter, one slip of the quill, could undo days of work. The ink, too, was temperamental. Often made from gallnuts mixed with iron salts and gum, it stained deeply. A drop spilled in the wrong place left a permanent blot. Quills wore down quickly and needed constant reshaping. The act of writing was not smooth or effortless. It was a continual struggle with imperfect tools and unforgiving materials. Monks wrote not in their own words but in service to tradition. They copied scripture, the writings of church fathers, and, sometimes, ancient works of philosophy, medicine, or science. Their task was not to create but to preserve. And so the hours stretched on, filled with repetition. Imagine writing the same psalms again and again, your hand aching, your mind wandering, yet bound by obedience to complete the task. The monotony could feel suffocating. Some scribes left behind marginal notes, small comments scribbled in the edges of manuscripts, hidden among the sacred text. These notes reveal their fatigue and frustration. One wrote, "As the harbor is welcome to the sailor, so is the last line to the scribe." Another lamented, "Oh, my hand." Another confessed, "This parchment is hairy." These voices, faint but human, break through the silence of centuries. They remind us that beneath the devotion was weariness, and beneath the duty was longing for relief. But the work was more than physical. It carried spiritual weight. To copy Holy Scripture was to participate in its preservation for eternity. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized obedience, and in the scriptorium, obedience meant not only accuracy but also humility. A scribe could not improvise. He could not alter. His personality was erased in service to the text. And yet, this very erasure gave rise to power. By deciding what to copy, and what not to, monasteries shaped the intellectual survival of Europe. Texts deemed unworthy disappeared into histories. Silence. Those chosen for copying lived on. This subtle power was not always acknowledged, but it mattered. A scribe's fatigue might cause him to omit a line, altering a text unknowingly. An abbot's decision might prioritize one book over another, preserving a saint's life while letting a scientific treatise vanish. In this way, the burden of scribes was not only physical but historical. Their daily struggles determined what future generations would read, or never read at all. Consider the effect on the body after years of work. Eyesight dimmed from long hours of close focus, leaving many scribes nearly blind in old age. Spines bent permanently from stooping. Hands twisted with cramps and arthritis. A monk might spend decades in the scriptorium, his body worn down until he could no longer hold a quill. And yet, such suffering was not pitied but praised. To give one's body to the service of texts was seen as a worthy sacrifice, a sign of obedience and devotion. But devotion did not erase frustration. A scribe might be interrupted mid-task by the tolling of bells calling him to prayer. Hours of labor left unfinished had to be set aside. He might return only to find his ink dried, his rhythm broken. A day's progress might amount to a single page. The slowness could feel unbearable, especially when the work demanded endless repetition. And always, there was silence. In the scriptorium, as in the cloister, silence was enforced. Conversation was forbidden except for essential matters. A monk sat alone in thought, hearing only the scratching of quills around him. Loneliness pressed in. The desire to speak, to laugh, to share frustration, had to be swallowed. Instead, the walls echoed only with the unending whisper of ink against parchment. Yet despite these burdens, the work of scribes carried immense significance. The libraries of monasteries grew, preserving knowledge through centuries of war, famine, and political upheaval. Without these weary monks, the works of Aristotle, Galen, Augustine, and countless others might have been lost forever. Their suffering bore fruit far beyond their lifetimes. Still, one cannot help but wonder, did the monks know? As they bent over pages in dim light, their hands aching and their minds numb, did they realize the weight of their labor on history? Or were they simply enduring another long day, another page, another line? The scriptorium remains silent now, its benches empty, its lamps cold. But the manuscripts endure, filled with both the sacred words they preserved and the faint, human whispers of those who copied them. And in that silence, one question lingers: was the work of the scribes a noble devotion, or was it a burden too heavy, demanded by obedience rather than chosen by love? The scriptorium was more than a workshop, it was a stage where obedience, fatigue, and hidden desires played out in the smallest of strokes. Each letter a monk wrote was a reflection not only of the sacred text but of his own endurance. Yet in this world of silence and ink, mistakes, temptations, and even subtle rebellions emerged, reminding us that behind the holy image of scribes were very human men. For a medieval scribe, error was not simply inconvenient, it was dangerous. A misplaced letter could distort the meaning of a word. An omitted line could shift theology. A miscopied passage could alter how future generations read the Bible or Aristotle or Augustine. And yet, mistakes were inevitable. Hours of copying strained the eyes and dulled the mind. A monk might lose his place in the text, skipping from one line to another. He might drift into drowsiness during the long afternoon hours, only to wake and find his hand had wandered across the page. Corrections were possible, but limited. A sharp knife could scrape away ink, but too much scraping weakened the parchment until it tore. Some errors were left in place, accompanied by tiny notes in the margin. Others passed unnoticed, carried forward into future. Copies. A single sleepy slip of a quill in one century could echo through centuries of copied manuscripts, reshaping history without intention. The weight of this responsibility was heavy. Imagine leaning over a page, the candlelight flickering, your eyes blurred from strain, knowing that your hand was the fragile link between past and future. The anxiety pressed constantly. For monks taught that every action was a reflection of obedience, error felt not only like failure but like sin. Obedience demanded that scribes erase themselves from the text. Their task was to copy faithfully, without alteration. But the human mind resists erasure. And so, in the quiet margins of manuscripts, small acts of self-expression appeared. A monk might doodle a face or animal in the corner. He might slip in a playful line, "The work is long, my hand is weary." He might even leave coded remarks about the weather, his hunger, or his boredom. These marginalia reveal a hidden world. They are confessions of frustration, humor, even rebellion. They remind us that even in silence, monks found ways to leave traces of themselves. Some drawings are crude, others intricate. A few are satirical, poking fun at authority. In a world where speech was restricted, the margin became a whisper of freedom. But this freedom carried risk. To write anything unnecessary on parchment was to waste expensive material. To leave drawings near holy text bordered on irreverence. Some abbots punished monks who indulged too freely in marginal play. And yet, the practice endured. It was perhaps the only outlet for creativity in a life otherwise ruled by obedience. Not all struggles in the scriptorium were about fatigue or temptation. Some were about power. The decision of which texts to copy was rarely neutral. Abbots, bishops, and patrons directed scribes toward works that reinforced certain values. A monastery might copy hagiographies, the lives of saints, over scientific treatises. Another might prioritize theology over history. In this way, the scriptorium shaped what knowledge survived. If Aristotle was preserved, it was because some abbot decided his words mattered. If certain pagan works vanished, it was because no monk was ordered to copy them. Scribes themselves might have little say, but their obedience made them instruments of choice. Their silence gave abbots quiet control over intellectual survival. The irony is sharp. The scribe, bowed over his parchment, might feel powerless, but his hand carried the weight of centuries. Even a weary monk, copying line after line in obscurity, determined what future scholars would know. His obedience created continuity. His mistakes created divergence. His silence created history, years of such work left scars. Chronic eye strain led to blindness. Hunched posture produced lasting deformities. Fingers stiffened with arthritis from constant quill work. Monks often complained in their marginalia of cold hands in winter, of backs aching, of hunger gnawing during long hours. The diet of monks, simple bread, beans, vegetables, and little meat, did little to strengthen them for such labor. Fasting days further weakened their bodies. And yet, the scriptorium demanded steady hands and steady focus. Imagine writing after fasting all day, your stomach growling, your vision dimming, your body trembling with fatigue. The physical suffering was part of the labor, endured in silence, beyond body and text. Scribes bore a spiritual weight. They were told their work was sacred, but in the endless repetition, the sacred often blurred into the mechanical. Reciting psalms by rote was one thing, copying them letter by letter, year after year, risked draining them of meaning. Monks wrestled with dryness of spirit, with the fear that their devotion had become hollow. They questioned whether they truly served God, or only ink and parchment. And yet, obedience demanded perseverance. To doubt was to sin. So they bent again to their work, suppressing question. Enduring monotony, and trusting that devotion might emerge through discipline, the manuscripts remain. Their lines are straight, their letters precise, their margins sometimes filled with doodles or laments. They are treasures of human history, products of obedience and suffering, of silence and resilience. But behind them lies a question: were the scribes saints of preservation, or prisoners of duty? Did they copy with faith, or simply because they had no choice? Was the ink they spilled an offering to God, or a slow sacrifice of their humanity? The quills are silent now, but the question remains. The monastery's scriptorium has long since gone quiet. The quills are broken, the lamps extinguished, the benches empty. And yet, what was written there centuries ago still shapes the world. To understand the legacy of medieval scribes is to see both the cost of their obedience and the endurance of their labor. Their sacrifices were hidden, their names often forgotten, but the ink they spilled outlived them all. When Europe staggered through invasions, plagues, and the collapse of kingdoms, the monastery remained. Its walls stood firm when towns burned and libraries crumbled. Inside, scribes labored in obscurity, their backs bent and their hands raw, copying texts one line at a time. They preserved the scriptures, ensuring continuity of the Christian faith. But they also preserved fragments of a wider world, medical treatises, mathematical theories, ancient philosophy. Without these scribes, much of antiquity might have vanished forever. Works of Aristotle, Galen, and Cicero survived because monks deemed them worth copying. It was not a grand plan but the slow accumulation of individual efforts, performed under obedience. Each weary monk, hunched over a candlelit page, contributed a thread to the tapestry of human knowledge, yet this achievement came at a cost. The body bore the weight, blindness, arthritis, bent spines, chronic pain. The mind carried the burden of monotony and doubt. The spirit endured the suffocation of silence and obedience. For many monks, their lives passed without recognition, their individuality erased. They became anonymous hands in history's margins. One cannot help but wonder, did they believe their sacrifices mattered? Or did they die unsure, their manuscripts stacked neatly on shelves, their names lost even to their brothers? In the silence of their cloisters, perhaps they never knew that centuries later, their work would be hailed as the lifeline of civilization. What survived was not random. Choices, conscious or unconscious, were made. Abbots directed scribes toward texts that aligned with theology. Works considered pagan, frivolous, or dangerous often went unpreserved. Entire traditions were silenced not by fire, but by neglect. The absence of copying was itself a form of erasure. Thus, the scriptorium was both a sanctuary of preservation and a gatekeeper of forgetting. The monks, in their silence, carried a quiet power, to decide what lived and what died in history. That power was hidden beneath obedience, but its impact was immense. Even so, the monks themselves did not vanish entirely. Their voices, faint but human, remain in the margins of manuscripts. Jokes, doodles, laments, "Oh, my hand, this parchment is hairy, I am so cold." These whispers break through the silence, reminding us that behind the sacred pages were men of flesh and weakness. Their humanity, suppressed in life, survives in the smallest details. It is this contrast, the grand preservation of knowledge against the small sufferings of individuals, that defines the legacy of scribes. The world remembers their manuscripts but forgets their exhaustion. We study their precise lettering but overlook their cramped fingers. Their labor built a bridge across centuries, but their own lives were lived in shadows. As you leave the scriptorium in your imagination, closing the heavy wooden door and stepping into the cloister, you may feel both awe and unease. The scribes' work preserved civilization, but at what price? Their obedience gave us continuity, but it also silenced their voices. Their manuscripts are treasures, but their lives were often burdens. Perhaps the final question is this: was their sacrifice chosen, or was it demanded? Did they copy with joy, or because they could not refuse? And does it matter, when the result, our access to centuries of human thought, stands unshaken? The ink is dry, the hands that wrote it long gone, but their legacy remains, a library of survival, written in silence, shaped by obedience, carried through suffering, and left behind as history's quiet gift. The monastery, from the outside, appeared a place of peace. Its walls enclosed silence, prayer, and a rhythm of life untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But peace was enforced, and behind the calm lay discipline, strict, unyielding, and at times, harsh. For medieval monks, punishment was not an exception but a constant shadow. The rule governed every action, and where the rule was broken, discipline followed. The rule of Saint Benedict, the foundation of most medieval monastic life, left no ambiguity: obedience was paramount. Disobedience was not simply disloyalty to the abbot, it was disobedience to God. To falter was to sin, and sin demanded correction. Punishment, then, was framed as medicine for the soul. But medicine can be bitter, and for monks, it often came in forms that tested their bodies, spirits, and dignity. For small infractions, the punishments could seem almost trivial. A monk who spoke when silence was required might be forced to eat alone, cut off from the community. Another who laughed at the wrong time might be excluded from prayers, made to stand apart while his brothers chanted together. For many, this exclusion was more painful than physical pain. It was a reminder that he had failed to belong. Silence was both shield and weapon. To be ignored by the community, treated as invisible, could feel like exile even within the cloister walls. A monk's identity was bound to his brothers. To lose that bond was to feel abandoned. Greater sins required greater punishment. One of the most humiliating practices was public confession. A monk who had committed a serious offense, whether disobedience, neglect of duty, or even anger, might be made to throw himself face down before the abbot and brothers, begging forgiveness. He might remain prostrate through services, his body stretched on the cold stone floor, while his brothers stepped past him. This act of humiliation was meant to crush pride, to remind the offender of his lowliness. But for the monk, enduring it, the weight was emotional as well as physical. His failure was on display, his shame magnified by ritual, and then there were harsher measures. Corporal punishment was not unknown in monasteries. Some abbots wielded rods, beating disobedient monks as one might chastise a child. Whipping was used for those who broke vows, fell into repeated errors, or resisted authority. To modern ears, it may sound cruel, but in the medieval mind, physical pain was a tool of correction. To strike the body was to heal the soul. Not all abbots were gentle in their authority. Some ruled with iron hands, quick to punish and slow to forgive. Chronicles tell of monks whipped, confined to cells, denied food, or forced to stand through long hours of prayer without relief. In some communities, the lash became a regular reminder of obedience. Food was another tool of discipline. A monk who erred might be forced to fast, eating only bread and water while his brothers received the usual plain meal of beans or vegetables. Others were denied wine, a small comfort in many monasteries. Some were excluded from meals entirely, left to go hungry. For men already living on meager diets, such punishments cut deeply. Hunger gnawed at their bodies, weakening their ability to work and pray. But hunger was also spiritualized. To suffer hunger was to remember Christ's fasting, to endure as a form of penance. In this way, deprivation became both punishment and lesson that in more severe cases, monks were locked away. Solitary cells, cold and dark, awaited those whose disobedience threatened the community. Isolation stripped away companionship, leaving only silence and stone. A monk confined might spend days or weeks alone, praying, fasting, and reflecting on his failures. To modern eyes, this resembles imprisonment. To medieval monks, it was correction. Yet the toll was heavy. Loneliness could break the spirit as surely as the rod broke the body. Some men emerged repentant. Others, perhaps, emerged shattered. For the gravest sins, discipline extended beyond the monastery. Excommunication, the cutting off of a monk from the sacraments and prayers of the Church, was the ultimate threat. To be excommunicated was to be spiritually dead, a fate more terrifying than physical death. Though rarely imposed, its possibility hung like a shadow over every monk's life, and yet, even under such discipline, rebellion stirred. Human beings resist when pressed too hard. Some monks complied outwardly while nurturing resentment within. Others pushed boundaries quietly, speaking when forbidden, hoarding small possessions, stealing food, or slipping away from work. A few resisted openly, challenging abbots, questioning rules, or refusing obedience. Monastic chronicles speak of quarrels, rivalries, even physical fights within cloisters. Not all monks were meek and silent, many were restless, angry, or ambitious. The strict discipline that bound them together also bred tension, and sometimes that tension boiled into dissent. Discipline was the backbone of the monastery, shaping monks into obedient servants of God. But discipline also revealed the fragility of obedience. Too much punishment bred resentment. Too much humiliation sparked rebellion. And so we are left with a question: did punishment truly heal the soul, or did it wound it further? Did the rod and the fast bring monks closer to holiness, or did they drive some into bitterness and despair? The monastery walls echo with silence, but within that silence lies the faint sound of both obedience and resistance. Which voice truly defined the cloister, the bowed head of submission, or the hidden whisper of dissent? The monastery was built on obedience, and yet obedience was never absolute. Human nature bends, but it does not always break. Beneath the surface of chance, silence, and discipline, a current of resistance always stirred. Some monks found ways to endure quietly, while others risked everything to rebel against the system that bound them. Most dissent was quiet, almost invisible. A monk might whisper a few forbidden words during silence, sharing a joke or thought with a trusted brother. Another might steal a scrap of food, a hunk of bread hidden away for later. These acts were not dramatic, but they carried weight. They were assertions of individuality in a life that demanded conformity. Books tell of monks who hoarded small personal objects, pieces of cloth, a knife, or even a feather quill, items forbidden under the rule of Saint Benedict. Possession of such things was a reminder that they were still men, not just faceless servants of God. The rule insisted that everything be held in common, but human instinct often resisted total surrender. Then there were the murmurers. Monastic texts warn against murmuring, the quiet complaining that spread discontent. Murmuring was seen as especially dangerous because it infected the community. A single monk's dissatisfaction could ripple outward, undermining obedience. But murmuring was natural. Monks complained of harsh abbots, of poor food, of endless labor, of unfair punishments. Though often spoken in whispers, these words carried the seed of rebellion. At times, dissent was louder. Chronicles tell of quarrels erupting within monasteries, shouting matches in cloisters, disputes during chapter meetings, even physical fights. The very men who were sworn to peace sometimes struck one another in anger. These conflicts revealed the strain of monastic life. The rule sought to suppress individuality, but ambition, pride, and temper still lived in monks' hearts. Rivalries formed, sometimes over positions of authority, sometimes over small slights. In the quiet corridors of stone, grudges grew just as weeds did in the gardens. The greatest conflicts arose when monks turned against their abbots. The abbot, as spiritual father, held immense power. He governed meals, prayers, punishments, and privilege. But not all abbots ruled wisely. Some were harsh, others corrupt, still others overly lenient. When an abbot lost the trust of his monks, rebellion followed. Records from across Europe tell of monks who refused obedience, who confronted their abbot in chapter, or who appealed to higher church authorities for his removal. At times, abbots were deposed, stripped of authority by the very men they were meant to lead. Such rebellions reveal that monasteries were not as uniform as they appeared. Behind the discipline, power struggles simmered. The cloister was not only a house of prayer, it was also a house of politics. Some monks chose a more dramatic escape, flight. To abandon the monastery was a grave offense, but it happened often enough to alarm abbots. Runaway monks sought freedom in towns, on farms, or in distant lands. Some fled because of harsh discipline, others because of longing for family, or desire for pleasures denied within the walls. The Church condemned such deserters, branding them as oath-breakers. Yet their actions remind us of the limits of endurance. Not every man could survive the burden of obedience, and some chose exile over silence. Resistance was not always physical. Some monks resisted with words. Letters and chronicles sometimes recorded complaints about abbots, the harshness of rules, or the corruption of leaders. These writings give us glimpses of dissenting voices, men who refused to accept discipline without question. A monk might describe the unfair punishments he saw, or hint at the cruelty of his superior. Though such writings were often careful, they reveal that resistance lived even in the world of parchment and ink. The Church feared rebellion within monasteries, for monasteries were meant to symbolize order and devotion. When dissent grew too strong, bishops or papal authorities intervened. Visitation records show bishops investigating complaints, correcting abuses, and sometimes replacing abbots, but often, the solution was strict discipline. More rules were added, punishments reinforced, and obedience demanded with greater force. In this way, rebellion led not to freedom but to tighter control. For the monks themselves, resistance was dangerous. To defy the abbot risked punishment, humiliation, even excommunication. To flee meant losing the community and possibly salvation. And yet, men resisted all the same. Why? Perhaps because even in the cloister, the human spirit longed for freedom. The silence of the monastery could not silence individuality completely. The rod could not entirely break the will. Even surrounded by walls, men dreamed of choice. Quiet resistance and open rebellion both tell us something important. The monastery, for all its rules, was not a place of perfect harmony. It was a place where men struggled, not only against sin and temptation, but against the weight of discipline itself. And so we are left to wonder, was dissent a sign of failure, or was it proof that monks remained human? Could a monastery truly function if every voice were silenced, or did murmuring and resistance play a role in balancing authority? The stone walls echo with chants, but behind the chants there is another sound, the low hum of defiance. Which was stronger in the end, the rod of discipline, or the whisper of rebellion? The monastery was never meant to be a battlefield. Its walls were built to enclose peace, silence, and prayer. Yet within those same walls, conflicts played out, between abbots and their monks, between rules and desires, between obedience and freedom. Punishments reminded monks of their vows, while rebellions reminded abbots of their limits. Together, they left a lasting mark on the history of monasticism, and on the culture of Europe itself. For all its harshness, discipline gave monasteries their identity. Without strict rules, without punishments to enforce them, the cloister would have dissolved into chaos. The very survival of monastic life depended on order. Every bell that rang, every silence observed, every punishment carried out reinforced the monastery as a world apart. Outsiders noticed this order. Travelers often wrote of the stillness and discipline of monks, contrasting them with the noise and disorder of towns. Kings and nobles, impressed by this discipline, trusted monks to manage lands, record histories, and pray for the realm. Monastic order gave monasteries prestige, and with prestige came influence, but order came with a cost. For the individual monk, strict discipline often meant the suppression of self. To be punished for speaking, for eating too much, or for questioning an abbot was to be reminded that one's will did not matter. In seeking to break the pride of men, monasteries sometimes broke their spirits instead. And yet, this very cost may explain why monasteries endured. Individual freedom was sacrificed so that the community might survive. In a world of war, famine, and instability, the cloister's strict rules created an island of permanence. But permanence was purchased with silence. Rebellion, too, had its place. While abbots condemned murmuring, complaints, and disobedience, these were signs that the system was still alive. If monks had truly surrendered all will, there would have been no resistance at all. Quiet defiance, open quarrels, even flight from the cloister, all of these acted as a reminder that abbots could not rule without regard for those beneath them. When monks rebelled, they forced reform. Harsh abbots were corrected, corrupt leaders removed, excessive rules softened. Dissent ensured that monastic life did not collapse under its own rigidity. In this sense, rebellion was not simply destructive, it was also creative, shaping monasteries into institutions that could adapt and endure. The struggle between discipline and dissent also revealed the monastery as a political body. Abbots ruled like lords, monks resisted like subjects, bishops intervened like judges. The cloister, though cut off from the world, mirrored the tensions of the world outside. In many cases, monasteries served as training grounds for the balance of authority and resistance. Just as kings learned to negotiate with nobles, abbots learned to deal with dissenting monks. The push and pull of discipline and rebellion within monasteries reflected, and perhaps even influenced, the governance of medieval Europe. One of the greatest legacies of monastic discipline was the preservation of knowledge. Without the strict enforcement of routine, monks might not have copied manuscripts so faithfully. Without the rhythm of silence, the scriptoria might not have produced works of such consistency. The discipline that burdened monks also created the conditions in which ancient texts, biblical commentaries, and historical chronicles could survive. Yet rebellion had its role here as well. Marginal notes, doodles, and complaints scribbled in the edges of manuscripts remind us that monks were not mere machines. Their humanity slipped into the margins, leaving us traces of their wit, frustration, and individuality. The very manuscripts preserved by discipline were also shaped by dissent. What emerges from the history of punishments and rebellions is a portrait of the monastery not as a place of perfect holiness, but as a place of human struggle. Monks were not saints untouched by desire, nor were they prisoners without hope. They were men living within a system that demanded much of them, sometimes too much. Some endured, bending to the rules. Others resisted, carving out small spaces of freedom. Still others broke away entirely, abandoning the cloister for the wider world. Their choices, in all their variety, remind us that even in the most disciplined of environments, humanity endures. Looking back, one might ask, what do punishments and rebellions within monasteries teach us now? Perhaps they show that no system can exist without tension. Too much discipline suffocates, too much rebellion destroys. The balance between order and freedom is fragile, and it must constantly be negotiated. The monks, in their silence and dissent, lived out this balance every day. Their punishments remind us of the dangers of control without compassion. Their rebellions remind us of the importance of questioning authority. Together, they illustrate the timeless truth that communities survive not by crushing individuality, but by allowing it to breathe within boundaries. And so we come to the end of the cloister story. The punishments are recorded in the rules and chronicles. The rebellions are whispered in complaints and scribbled in margins. The discipline shaped the monastery's strength, the dissent revealed its humanity. As you imagine the monastery's heavy doors closing behind you, leaving the cloister in silence once more, a question lingers: did the monks ultimately triumph over their own desires through discipline, or did their quiet acts of rebellion ensure that their humanity was never fully erased? The answer, like the cloister itself, remains suspended between silence and song.